I'm Paul from CircleCI, and I'm here to talk quite a lot about Docker. And the things I'm going to talk about in Docker are not solutions. They're not a new way of doing things in Docker. It's actual problems that I don't understand how to solve, and I don't understand how people are doing this in Docker. And I want people to tell me how they're doing it, tell me how they've seen people doing it, and talking about the general sort of Docker and testing space, which is a little bit of a mess. So this is what CircleCI does. We're continuous integration, continuous delivery. People build their people take their code, they test it on CircleCI, and they continuously deliver it into the cloud somewhere. And now we also do this. I don't know if you saw what I did there, but I took the previous thing. I removed the cloud and I put a container on it because we also do continuous integration, continuous delivery of containers. So you can build your CircleCI. Or you can use CircleCI to build your container, to validate your container, to run tests against your container, against like local databases and MySQL and Mongo, and also do your browser testing, do your iOS testing, all in one nice place, and then ship it to Docker Hub or AWS or Kubernetes. So this is the sort of context that I'm thinking about. How do people build and validate, in particular, their Docker containers and all of their entire sort of service-oriented architecture? So the first question is, how do you test images? So if in the current way that people run their tests, they have their tests in their code base. So you run your unit test. Let's say you use Ruby and you use Cucumber. You have your dependencies set up to install Cucumber, and then you run Cucumber integrated into your code base a little bit. It sets up tests, or it sets up your databases, and it runs a web server, and it does all this nice sort of stuff for you. But if you take that code and you put it into a container, what are you supposed to do with Cucumber? Are you putting your testing tools into your production container? Are you putting your compile tools into your production container if you're using a compiled language? It's kind of unclear how people do this. There aren't really any best practices. No one really talks about how they do it, and I think what people actually do is they build they run all their tests in their sort of dev environment, and then they ship a compiled binary or the code or whatever it is into the container, and they don't actually test their container itself, which is wrong. You know, is clearly not the right way to do it. So interested in best practices around this. The second question is, how do people do integration tests? If you have one monolith that's running in Docker, well, obviously you're doing it wrong because you're not doing microservices and whatever else is shiny these days. But you want to be able to test all of those containers against each other, and there really isn't a best practice way of even specifying what these things are. So the related problem to this is dev production parity. The whole point of having a way of specifying what's in your containers is that you can test it locally, you can test it in production, you can test it in staging, and it all uses the same image. But Docker, or at least sort of best practices in Docker today, there isn't really a way of having your dev environment be the same, or having both a dev environment and a production environment set up in the same way in Docker. So to give you an example of this, let's suppose that you're using Go. In Go, you have a dev environment which has 500 megabytes of Go compilers. And you'll see the Docker, if you've ever contributed to Docker's dev environment includes all this stuff. So there's 500 megabytes of things to compile, and it compiles your app down to a 1 megabyte binary. And obviously, you take that 1 megabyte binary, you put it on a stock Ubuntu, and you have your production thing. But there isn't a good way of doing those two things in the same repo, in the same time. How your dev environment is not your production environment. If you're testing it on your dev environment, which has 500 megabytes of Go stuff, then it's not the same as your production environment. And there is really no way of doing this well. So you can't build Docker containers from within Docker containers. So if you're doing all this stuff in your dev environment, you can't build your production Docker container from it. There's things you can do around sharing environments, but there isn't or sharing directories, but there isn't really tooling around this. And in particular, if you look at the tools that exist. So Docker Compose is one tool that exists for setting up dev environments, but it doesn't really support this sort of thing, this sort of use case. And even if it did, it's a dev time tool, and it's different from something like Kubernetes, which is your production time tool for doing the same thing. So dev production parity, problem. No one really knows how to do it very well in the Docker or container ecosystem. And then how do you test your images? That's the other problem I had. If you have good answers to any of these, I'm Paul at CircleCI.com. Would love to hear any sort of thoughts on what people have. Thank you.